Welcome back to part 2 of our Wood Elf Queen painting tutorial, and in the first part of this second part we are going to be painting up the skin, and I'm actually not going to show you this part. Yes, sorry, a little weird way to start out this video. However, the video that I did just before this one on layering versus glazing, that went over my skin painting technique, and I'm using the exact same technique here. The only difference here is when it comes to the undercoating. On the previous video, I decided to try out a violet undercoat, but on this one I used my standard dark Shadows Flesh recipe for the undercoat to cover up the black primer. Now when it comes to our glazes, that's a little bit different. For the skin tone here, I didn't want a purple undercoat. What I actually wanted was something a little bit more brown, not woody or anything like that, but just a little bit more of a brown tone. So for the shadow regions, I'm taking my Shadows Flesh and mixed a little flat brown in with that, and I'm gently applying it to the recessed areas. Once again, glazes super duper thin, basically watercolor, and just adding a little bit of tone, a little bit of darkness, but mainly color to those recessed regions. And then as standard, a glaze of game color Gory Red, mainly applied to the nose and the cheeks and a few other areas here and there. Always brightens up the skin tone, makes it look much more alive, having that rosy glow in various spots. Alright, now on to her dress, and for that I'm using a mix of emerald green and uniform green. Now being a wood elf queen, we of course have to go for green for forest colors, much like we did with the leafy wings. So we're tied to a green color, however we don't want to use the exact same shades that we used on the leaves. This is a dress, those were leafy wings. So I'm using the uniform green that we did use on the wings, however I'm mixing it with about an equal amount of emerald green, which is a very cool green color. For the highlights, I'm going to mix in some game color Dead Flesh, and I'm going to do this twice. And once again, we are doing our color transitions, just like we did on the wings. However, we're doing it upside down or right side up, depending on how you want to look at it. So we are going to be highlighting towards the direction that our highlights would normally go. So we're going to go lighter up towards the top of the dress. So all these highlights are concentrating more on the top side. We're getting the folds. The bottom area of the dress we really don't have to worry about. And since we're trying to do a color transition, the folds around the medium area of the dress, the folds are getting highlighted there. However, as we move up towards the higher end of the dress, we start highlighting more in the base coat area. So highlights small on the darker green middle, and since we want to color transition to a bit of a lighter yellow color, as we move up on the dress, we expand this color that was just a highlight below, now it's becoming a base coat up above. One final highlight, new mix now, uniform green, white, and Dead Flesh. We've eliminated the very cool emerald green. So here we have the start of the color transition on the dress, just like we did with the leaves. However, this is a little bit different. We're not going to a bright yellow or a yellowish white color. I'm taking it more up to a kind of light green. So we have the same effect used on two different areas of the miniature. However, the colors we use are different, and also the intensity of the effect is different. And this is our results before moving on to the shaded areas or bottom part of the dress. So for our shade, we are going to go much like we did with the wings, starting off with some stormy blue. Note when you are trying to glaze a very heavy color like this, you have to start out slow, and it tends to go a little bit blotchy at the beginning. But after putting down about 3 or 4 or 5 thin glaze layers, the color will slowly build up. Much like with the highlights, we are being a little bit more reserved with our colors down below. I want to keep this dress mostly green, so concentrating the blue just towards the hem where it's a solid color, and then I'm working it up into the shadow areas, the recesses of the dress as we move a little bit further up. So we have a nice smooth transition. There's a little bit more color in the shadows, but the highlights retain that original green color. And then we finish off with our violet, not using violet this time, actually a mix of gory red and hexed lichen. So somewhat similar in color. We did use the hexed lichen on the leafy wings. However, here it's just a little bit more red to make it a bit brighter since it's such a small portion of the dress. So again, pretty much exact same color combination, color transition that we used on the leafy wings. Except for here, it's turned on its head, and also it's not as intense on the wings, and we use slightly different colors, but they still tie into each other because overall, in general, they have the same colors. Quick note on her wooden tree stump base. I already covered painting the wood in part 1, but I want to mention it here because in this case here, we have a very large chunk of wood, not those thin little branches that we had around the arms. So even though I use the exact same colors here that I used there, because it's a larger surface area, more detail, we have to add some extra detail. So I went one more highlight up and went to a buff, and then for the bottom area I applied a wash of military green. So there's a little bit of moisture in the earth. That green also, once again, helps tie everything together. Green in the dress, green in the wings, a little bit of green in the base as well. I often mention that the one negative of using black primer is sometimes you have to undercoat first before applying certain colors, otherwise they look dull. However, I'm going to show you here how we can actually use that negative as a positive. I gave a single coat of model color burnt red to the hair, covered everything, and it was a little bit dull because it's going over the black primer. Then what I did was apply a second coat. However, I'm not covering the exact same area. I'm actually applying this more as a base coat, leaving that first area as a shade color. So we have the burnt red that's darkened by the black primer lying underneath, and then we have our base coat, which is burnt red layered over burnt red. So we're getting two highlights using one color. For the rest of the process here, we're going to be using two colors for our highlights: Model Color Cavalry Brown and Game Color Parasite Brown, with a 50-50 mix in between. However, I also want to explain why I'm going with red hair. Well, let's look at the colors that we've already used on the miniature and what type of hair would fit in this situation to best accentuate the colors that we used. Black and white are out because we don't have any black or white anywhere on the model. The hair would stick out like a sore thumb. We could possibly go with some shade of brown. However, we would have to stay away from the browns that we used on the wood, so her hair didn't end up looking like wood. Now we could go for blonde. That would work because we do have yellow in the wings and yellow in the wood. So as long as a different shade, a brighter shade of blonde hair, that would work. However, I decided to go back to the brown color, make it a reddish brown instead, so it ties into the wood rather than tying into the leafy wings, and still stands out a bit. We're going to be adding a little bit more red on the project here and there, so The hair does not stick out like a sore thumb, and I'm trying to keep the colors a little bit more on the reddish brown side. We have Parasite Brown here, which is more of an orange brown. So we're not doing a dyed red hair look, you know, bright red. We're trying to keep those colors a little bit more into the brown range. Finally, we're starting to move into the tinier bits of the model, starting off with the leaves. The leaves I'm painting two different ways. The first way is Game Color Mutation Green with Game Color Pale Yellow added at first and then Deep Yellow. And then the other method not shown is Model Color Deep Green with Deep Yellow added for the highlights. Now the reason I'm just painting two different types of leaves is because we want some variety, but we do not want a huge amount of variety. This is going to become more important when it comes to painting the flowers. You can see with the flowers running down the dress, if we painted these like real flowers and used every single color in the rainbow, well, it's going to be a jumbled mess. It's going to look like a Jackson Pollock painting. So instead, we need to reduce the amount of colors we use here because the area is so small and compact. But we still want to add a little bit of variety. So all the flowers are base coated with hex lichen, and then half of the flowers I'm just doing a single highlight by adding white to our hexed lichen. And then for the other half of the flowers, I am highlighting those with magenta and then adding white to the magenta for their highlights. So much like with the leaves, we have a little bit of variety here. We just have two colors. We're not adding every single color in the rainbow, which would make the flowers actually very hard to see. And we're also using colors that we've used throughout the rest of the project. So we still have that red-violet color or magenta color, and we have our violet color now switched over to hexed lichen. So this ties into the dress, this ties into the wings, ties into pretty much everything. And then one last quick note, when working on something this small and this compact, you don't want to add too much contrast. Now, contrast is the key to painting, but when you have a very busy surface like this, too much contrast, again, like having too many colors, is just going to make everything too hard to see. And then for the center of the flowers, a little drop of Game Color Electric Blue. We haven't used a whole lot of blue on the model yet, at least not a bright blue like this, and admittedly it does look out of place here, but I'm going to be adding more blue to the rest of the flowers in just a moment. And speaking of the rest of the flowers, these are a little bit bigger, so we can add a few more highlights. And the colors that we're going to use here, well, just like the flowers above, have already been chosen by what colors we've used elsewhere on the model. The difference here is I try to mix the colors up in different orders and mix new colors together to make each flower unique. So here, violet with white for highlights, and then adding a little bit of a glaze wash of gory red. On some, I took violet red and highlighted by adding pink or sometimes white, but I painted each flower individually, one at a time, mixing up a new mix each time, so each one is just a little bit different. This is just a quick speed painted example, but just give you an idea. If I was doing this on a different flower, I may still start with the violet, but rather than purple, I may add pink to highlight the violet and then add white. And another flower, I may start with purple and give it a violet wash and then add white or pink or both to highlight it. So just mixing it up slightly on each flower. Ironically, the large flower she's standing on caused me the biggest problems. Much like the wood areas on the wings and the big wooden tree trunk, here we have a giant flower where elsewhere I just painted small flowers. So what I need to do here is to paint more detail onto this flower, but I found when I was doing that, it wasn't matching the rest of the flowers. So I had a struggle and I repainted this about 3 times. Eventually just going with magenta and white and putting on a few glazes of red and again magenta. So it's a little bit more interesting than the other flowers, but it doesn't stand out too much. Initially I tried to paint on a bit more texture here and it just did not work because it didn't look like it belonged with the rest of the flowers. Getting into those teeny tiny details now for you eyeball lovers. We start off by putting a dark brown into the eye sockets, usually camo black brown for me, and then we paint in the eyeball using game color bone white with some glaze medium to slow down the dry time. And then rather than doing one stroke, I actually am making tiny little dots and filling in the whole eyeball very slowly so I don't mess up. For the iris, going with model color black green. The color is so dark I don't think the green actually mattered. And then just a tiny spot of black for the pupil. If there are mistakes here, this is the time to go back with your whatever color, in my case camo black brown, and edge the eyeball to clean up any errors. When it comes to makeup, if you choose to add it, you don't want to use the color straight. It's going to look too intense. Instead, what you want to do is mix it with your base coat color. So in this case, I'm using beige red mixed with violet to give her a little bit of eyeshadow. And again, very thin, this color is being glazed on. And finally, we're getting to the refinement stage. This is where we go back over the whole model, check everything out, make sure all our colors are correct. In this case right here, decided to intensify the warmth, especially in the face, by adding another glaze of our game color gory red. I also tried to give her freckles, but I don't think it worked out, to be honest. Hard to do teeny tiny little freckles on a 70mm miniature. We also go back over the wings, look for anything we missed, and also tweak the colors slightly. In this case, even going a little bit higher than our pure yellow color, adding more white just on a few of the edges to get a bit more contrast out of those wings. And then finally, still working on the skin tone, decided I wanted a little bit more color in the recesses. So again, this time using Hull Red as a glaze, just adding a little bit of color and a little bit of shadow to that skin. Make it look more alive. And there we go, that is it. Our Forest Queen is done, and wasn't that easy. In a way, I found this project very easy because I did not really have to think about what colors to use. The color wheel told me what colors to use, and then I just took that ball and ran with it. Basically, the color wheel told me the best way to do our color transitions on the wings, and then we reversed that for the dress, use slightly different colors so it doesn't look exactly the same. And once I had those colors established, I knew what colors I wanted to use on the flowers because, again, we already used them on the other two areas in small amounts. And then for the flowers, we can increase the amount of that violet and purple color. Easy peasy. Now, just for the record, I don't normally follow a color wheel this closely. I wanted to kind of prove a point here, what we can do by relying on the color wheel or the color spectrum to choose our colors for us. Normally I just use whatever color I feel like it, but in this case this is something special. I don't want to give the misconception though that you have to follow a color wheel. You can if you want, and here is an example that it works very well. But again, you can use whatever color you want. So I hope you enjoyed. Hope this gave you some ideas of how you can work color transitions into your miniature and modeling projects. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
47 Keebler elves were killed today when a light plane plunged into their tree.
E.L. Fudge remains in critical condition.